lunch speaker this afternoon. We're pleased to have with us, and we're especially pleased because he's one of our fellows at the Wheatley Institution. He's a senior fellow in international affairs, Frederick Axelgard. Fred received master's and PhDs at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, which at that point was, and still is, I guess, affiliated with, so that there's an exchange association with Harvard. Some of you may know more about that than I do. He spent 2 years working on the staff of Senator Jake Barn from Utah, and then joined the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the, I guess, the major think tank in international affairs in Washington, D.C. He spent 8 years there. He developed expertise in his graduate studies and in his work in Middle East affairs. He spent 13 years in the State Department in various positions and locations. And most recently, he spent 10 years with General Dynamics, also working in the Mideast and Southern Asia especially. Is that? I've got most of the areas right. He brings rich experience to the Wheatley Institution and to this conference. So I'm pleased to introduce to you Fred Axelgard. You might want to move your chairs around if you can't see the screen.
I thought I'd use a few PowerPoint slides, knowing it's after lunch and not always the easiest time to address an audience. And anyway, I will wander a little bit. At the risk of getting completely off track, one of the memorable speeches I ever heard in my life was a man by the name of Stephen Covey, whom I think many of you know as one of the kind of business gurus over the last 20 or 30, 40 years. He came to Saudi Arabia when we lived there, and he was speaking in a hotel ballroom. Just a huge, huge audience, about 1,100 or 1,200 people, a lot of them in thobes and gutras. They're all in the Saudi dress. And he had he took a very bold stance. Saudi Arabia is not the easiest country to get around in, to get into. It is a very tightly bound society. And he kind of lectured them. He praised them and said, "You have one of the most devout and deep and established religious traditions of any country in the world." And he said, the strength that comes from that tradition should make Saudi Arabia one of the most open societies anywhere. And of course, there was kind of dead silence for a few minutes. I did recognize a few Saudi businessmen kind of nodding in agreement. And it goes to, I thought, A, it was brave, B, he was very correct, C, nothing much changed from his speech. But let me ask a question now that we have the idea of religion on the table. Think about Saudi Arabia. I'm going to ask you, let's see, I'd like 4 people to actually respond to the question. One from someplace in the East Coast, somebody from the South. I know there are people from all of these parts that have, okay. Somebody from the West Coast, and then one of the Intermountain people, okay. So, 4 of you will answer this question. Is Saudi Arabia a developing country? And what does religion have to do with your answer? All right, which part of is this the Intermountain?
Yeah, I'm from Idaho.
Okay, this is the Intermountain response. Thank you.
My answer would be yes, that it's still a developing country. And in the lens of religion, I would say it's still developing because there's a lot of inequalities between women and men, and they're still making advancements. And just that advancement in and of itself is a form of development. So I would say there's still political development that needs to happen in in Saudi Arabia, and they are still a developing country.
And religion's role in that or impact?
I would say that it's, if anything, it's somewhat retrogressive. I know a couple of weeks ago they finally added some women on a council, which was a big step.
Big deal,
They
big
finally
deal.
letting women drive as well as be out in public. But I would say, I mean, coming from my own religious viewpoint, I would say it is retrogressive, that it is causing de-development in the country because of the deep religious affiliations of the country, because of their views on women. It's not really
Okay.
working out for them.
Okay. All right. Which part of the country?
Well, I'm from the East Coast, but I go to school on the West Coast, so I don't know.
All right. We're going to count her as the West Coast is, okay?
Okay, so I would say Saudi Arabia is developed politically and in its government structure, but it's still developing socially, like what you said, because religion has such a strong impact on the culture, and there has been a lot of resistance to change under religion and change of social practices, which, like, a lot of things with, like, status of women have made it not what we would consider a developed country.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. So 2 answers so far focused a lot on political development and social development. Nobody's talked about, is it economically speaking a developing country?
Yes.
Not that anybody else has to answer that, but just an observation. I am an interested observer at this point. Okay? All right. So we have the West Coast, we have the Intermountain area. Who from the South? Who's from the South? We have one of our Chilean students that's going to answer the question. Where are they? Where are they? Sky, did you want to speak on behalf of the Chilean student?
I'm from Virginia.
You're from Virginia?
I think this is
That can work. All right. All right.
I
Are you from Northern Virginia or something?
I'm from the Shenandoah Valley.
right.
Sarcastically Confederates. That's a whole other topic.
Virginia developed country. All right.
I think in almost every
A little bit louder, if you would.
I think in almost every measure that we look at for developing nations across the globe, that we could consider Saudi Arabia a developed nation.
Developed.
Developed.
Okay.
But when we look at it cognitively and we look at like the structures of the society that we from a Western viewpoint we do not consider it developed. But from like quantitative analysis, I think it would be hard to say that it's not a developed nation in comparison to other key factors that other developed nations have.
Okay. And religion?
I think that's a normative argument. I think it's regressive from my viewpoint, but I don't know if I have the moral stance on whether or not. I think it should change, but I don't know if I have the moral standpoint to say that it should change it.
Okay. All right. One more answer from anybody, anywhere in the world.
Florida, so maybe
Florida.
from the East Coast.
Okay. Nice and loud.
When I was in Jordan last semester, and some of the Arabs that I talked to, when they talked about Saudi Arabia and extremism of their government.
Okay. A little bit louder. Go ahead and stand up, please.
When I talked to some of the Arabs in Jordan, and they brought up the extremism of the government there, and they said that it wasn't religious, it was purely governmental. It wasn't out of respect or out of reverence for Allah or for God, but rather it was more of a political play to set themselves up as a devout country. And so I guess religiously, maybe it's not. But I guess also if you're talking about development as freedom or development as opportunity, there's half the population who can't work. There's half the population who don't have the freedom to walk on the road. And that's not necessarily a high definition of development or freedom. But at the same time, if that's their choice, then that half of the population also has a lot of access to hair salons and malls and goods and makeup. And so I guess who's asking, I guess, we'll try back into what's your definition of development?
Yeah. I appreciate that. Saudi Arabia is a very complicated country, and my talk really hasn't had much to do at all about Saudi Arabia, or with Saudi Arabia. But besides being a very rich country with a lot of oil, besides being a very Islamic country, Saudi Arabia is a tribal country. okay? But maybe the best definition is it's a family business. And you think about the different, again, when you talk about development and trying to understand what's happening in a country with different sectors of society, when you think about Saudi women or you try and understand what is happening, it's complicated. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, well, I haven't been to all the roundtables, the national framework, the nation-state framework, is what most of our thoughts are taking place in. When Lant gave his presentation the other night, it was pretty much the systems he was talking about are systems that take place within the country. And I think the political violence or whatever you've been talking about, I would assume that a lot of what you've been doing is viewed in the context of a nation-state context. I want to talk a little bit about religion, and it's one of those things that it's hard to talk about. I've lived in a lot of different places. I've worked in a lot of different arenas. And in the United States and Western Europe, it's difficult to talk clearly and without discomfort about religion and its role in issues like development. I'm going to take a stab at it. I'm going to ask you to try and think not so much in a nation-state framework. I did economic development as one of my areas in my master's program. I worked at AID as an intern right after I left my master's degree. And since then have really not had much immediately and directly to do with development. But everything I have done, every direction I have looked in my international career, the implications of development are staring you right in the face. Whether you just, and mostly it's been political and security issues that I've dealt with. And it's kind of not just dishonest, but it's actually corrupting to me in your thinking to try and separate for too long the two ideas. Is what you're looking at an unstable situation? Is the violence happening because of political factors, or is there some underlying economic and social unrest, or do you explain, well, they aren't developing because there's political and security concerns at play? It's very, very hard in reality to separate the two. But from a policy perspective, and I dare say from an academic perspective, we tend to do that. Just like the discussion of Saudi Arabia, it's a messy, difficult thing to separate out these 3 or 4 factors about what's going on in the country and what really determines what happens. But as I'm not going to let my absence from the development world prevent me from making a few observations to you today. And I thought there's a subject area that has emerged that wasn't even anywhere on the horizon when I was in graduate school, called faith and development, or religion and development. And it's interesting enough, it's caught my attention, and the people in it are interesting enough that I'd like to suggest it as maybe a subcategory for your thought as you move through the field. Back in the Y2K time period, the president of the World Bank at the time, James Wolfensohn, kind of noticed there was a gap in the development fabric, the cooperation fabric that the development emerges from, and it was in the area of faith. He recognized, came to the conclusion that there are, in fact, a lot of reasons from a development perspective, and let me see if I think. All right. There we go. Okay, here is some of the rationale for faith and development. On the one hand, he was pretty humble about the things that development as then configured wasn't doing. Not always successful in addressing poverty. There's a wide range of different kinds of institutions need to be involved. Lant would agree with that. But diversity, local initiative, and creativity are essential. And he was basically saying we need more of that. when you turn to the faith groups that are out there in the world, think of them as a resource. They embody the largest network of services, development-related health, education, that are out there. Plus, if you think of development as a behavioral change, you think of the faith communities out there and the trust embedded in the leaders of the faith communities and the potential for behavioral change. Malaria, for example, I'll talk a little bit about that later. I'm not talking necessarily about moral change, simply going from a family that doesn't wash its hands to a family that does, and the resources that are available there. Plus, faith groups, they operate everywhere. And even when there's wars going on, people don't stop going to church or to mosque. Disease, natural disaster, political instability affect World Bank, IMF, other programs, but the faith communities are still out there. They tend to reach beyond where government-funded and government staff programs go, and they know the people. The local understanding, the initiative, it's there. It makes for a different look at development. Back in the Y2K time period, Wolfenson convened some high-level meetings. The Archbishop of Canterbury was the kind of personalities they had at those. There was a Faith Leaders Summit in the year 2000 as well, which kind of wagged its finger at the Political Leaders Summit that happened the same year. The Faith and Development Dialogue took as points of departure for their work the Millennium Development Goals and the declaration of support for those goals. As time went on in the early 2000s, the World Bank staff started participating in these meetings in larger numbers. The IMF head was even at some of the leadership meetings as well. New projects, new coalitions, some of them coalitions between faith units and government agencies, sometimes different faith communities, and sometimes I think there's a program or two out there where you've got the self-avowed agnostics uniting with faith communities to get stuff done. But something called the World Faith Development Dialogue did become institutionalized. It's actually housed at Georgetown University and run by a woman, a rather remarkable woman by the name of Catherine Marshall. She was Wolfenson's point person after about 30 years in the World Bank. She was his point person back in this time frame. And I had the chance a few weeks ago to spend some time with her. A lot of what I'm sharing with you grows out of that dialogue. I think it's important, again, I'll put this out on the table, not to make it hard for any of your roundtables and the assumptions you've been working from, but there is a tendency from the faith perspective to view development in a little bit different way. A lot of the problems and solutions that are envisioned by these groups are seen through the perspective of the family. Albania, for example, they brought people together and said, what are the most important problems facing you? Well, the fact that 40% of the families in Albania who have 3 kids or more are way below the poverty level. That's the concern, the way they voice their concerns. In Latin America, they see a direct linkage, again, between the breakdown of the family, gang-related activity amongst their kids, and the failing schools. They also tend to look at the end game a little bit differently. There was a group from Sri Lanka that was asked, what is the end game for development? And the difference between growth as an objective and life satisfaction. And the way they termed it, they really would rather seek the middle path to human liberation and a simple, content life rather than peg their development future to some quantitative goal measured in terms generally of GDP or income. I'm going to take a few minutes, and I apologize right off the bat. I've got a bunch of publications I brought with me. It's hard to try and sprinkle out information that will give you a feeling for a new and different discipline. But I thought I would take a stab at just illustrating the kinds of projects, kinds of initiatives that are out there. And malaria is very interesting because it is one of the issues, one of the big 3 diseases out there, along with HIV, AIDS, tuberculosis, threatening the world. But in 2006, a bunch of different groups, Roman Catholic, Hindu, Muslim, Baha'i, Anglican, Seventh-day Adventist, got together and decided they would do what they could to get the message out about containing malaria. And over the next 6 years, by last year, they trained about 21,000 religious leaders, however you want to define that term, and were able to reach 1.5 million people. And I imagine their budget probably was less than a third of the tuition of the you guys paid as a total in this room, just for this year. They get by on a shoestring, but are able to do quite a bit. In Uganda, again, in the area of healthcare, it turns out that about 70% of the, a third of the health facilities are owned or run by religious groups, Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, and they actually have a seat at the table. When the government sits down and develops policy, they actually have a seat at the table. That's the way they've institutionalized in Uganda. And it was done because of, again, a 100-year-old tradition in the country of the faith groups running hospitals and so forth. But money being what it is, priorities are shifting, and that particular role is under challenge right now. I mentioned this to some of you yesterday. There was an interesting something happened in Cambodia, and just to show you how it can happen. There was a pastor driving down the street, and he happens to see a guy standing by the side of the road, completely dazed look in his eye. He's got a scarf around his waist, and you stop and say, "What's going on? Can I be of help?" The guy had just been released from a maximum security prison near the Vietnamese border. The guy was on the opposite end of the country from his family, and literally all he had was this tunic around his waist. So the pastor takes him home, feeds him, gets him a ticket, and he makes it home in the next few days. But out of that encounter comes the recognition that in Cambodia, and again, I'm sure a lot of you know what's been going on in Cambodia the last 4 or 5 decades. But one of the least recognized problem populations, vulnerable populations, is the prison population. And over the course of the next 10 years, a group of, 22 different groups now are working, teaching both hygiene, moral education in the prisons in Cambodia. And again, this is so far below the threshold or the radar of what the normal NGO community would pick up on. But it is real, and it is an aspect of development, and it is something that is moving the needle in a lot of people's lives out there. I have no idea how at what point in time it actually will register on the Geiger counter, so to speak. But let me change direction just a little bit. These are the World Economic Forum. You wouldn't necessarily think of the folks at Davos as a faith-based community, but they did in the aftermath of 9/11 recognize there was a need for more dialogue between faith communities, and they actually established a council of 100 made up of people from business, from government, from all education, all across the spectrum. And they came to the conclusion after their deliberations that education by religion and about religion was one of the key weaknesses that leads to things like 9/11. Cultural literacy, so to speak, they've decided has suffered significantly because in public schools you don't teach about different religions anymore. I just found this to be very, very interesting. And there's a group called the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy, and I'll just put a plug in. This is going to be the focus of next year's WIAC, Religion and Diplomacy. But a man that I used to work for by the name of Doug Johnson founded the ICRD, and what they do, they take a more direct approach. They have workshops, they have a focus on Western Islamic relations, and they develop a workshop program where they actually go in and talk about religious values and their importance. And they have gone right into the heartland of the extremist madrasas in Pakistan with their workshops. But it's done on the basis of mutual respect. And one of the things about this madrasa system is that it's existed for 1,000 years. This is not, these guys are, these They were Oxford. They were around 400 years by the time Oxford was born. Let's put it that way, okay? And the respect that they showed for the traditions of the madrasas just opened the way for dialogue, and the idea of expanding the curriculum to go from just Islamic studies to scientific disciplines and other disciplines. It's all anecdotal evidence so far. It isn't moving the needle, but the courage and creativity of people like this, I think, is worth noting and deserves a place in the dialogue. In terms of epistemology, is that the right word? Lant made fun of it the other night. All right. How to actually get a handle on what is happening is very, very difficult. It's a monumental task. I found that there are a number of pretty well-known organizations, the Gates Foundation, together with this particular South African-based health program, are working to, again, map what is going on in the area of faith and African health. The UK version of AID, the DFID, commissioned a study at the University of Birmingham, same thing, trying to understand what's going on in the area of religions and development. The World Bank itself has done a lot of studies. I'm going to highlight here today, though, what the Georgetown University Berkeley Center has done. They took a 5-year project with the support of the Luce Foundation. They took a regional cut, they looked at 6 regions of the world, and then looked at 8 different issues. And the question basically is, who is doing what, where, and how, with what kind of support, and potentially even what kind of results. It's a very, very challenging thing to try and get their arms around. The methodology they chose, they did a literature search. They convened conferences, getting knowledgeable people to meet in these 6 different areas of the world and around these 8 different issues. And then after those consultations, they did at-length interviews with practitioners in the field. Again, all trying to get out, what are you doing, how are you doing it, how long have you been doing it, with what success? Again, I brought some publications with me that reflect some of this research that they've been doing. Not surprisingly, they came away with the key conclusions. Faith is a real piece of the development picture, to an extraordinary degree, diversity-wise, and to extraordinary depth. And that every aspect of development, in fact, does have a faith dimension to it. These are a little bit harder to read. It's a little bit busier slide, but the findings, I've alluded to some. I'll just run through them quickly. These faith-inspired groups have impact in rural areas like education, health, care for the young, and the environment. They are hindered in their ability to engage with more formal groups, with larger NGOs or government agencies or international agencies. They have a basic illiteracy in understanding what development is about, how it's done from the institutional perspective. But on the reverse side, there is a great deal of illiteracy on the part of the NGOs and the government agencies, international agencies, about development, about religion in the country itself. There is an issue with stereotypes. I found this was a great example. Apparently, Iran has had significant success in HIV/AIDS prevention. And one of the key pieces of that success is women's groups, growing out of faith-based religion, women's groups, working. And you wouldn't necessarily expect to see something like that happening out of Iran, but there you have it. Different faith traditions will have very different views about issues. Something like AIDS, though, again, you have to be ready for controversy, I guess. Habitat for Humanity, turns out, you may not realize, I didn't realize it, how deeply embedded in the faith tradition that effort is. But they are calling for an aggressive expansion of work with interfaith groups for the sake of building shelters out there. The conclusion was made that the larger faith groups, Catholic Relief Services, Islamic Relief, are the ones that should be working the AIDS issue. But the flip side, malaria, the disaggregated, decentralized nature of the work being done by the faith groups, malaria is very doable. Dealing with malaria is very doable from that perspective. The regimen of dealing with malaria prevention is something that can be done locally. Tuberculosis, on the other hand, doesn't necessarily lend itself to the same kind of approach. So they're starting to think through and differentiate approaches and issues and where they can be most effective. One of the big issues is proselytization, evangelization that happens in the context of development. And they need to harmonize their views about this. There are some groups that just feel it's part and parcel of what they do and who they are, and there's a lot of people just put off by it. But it's an issue that they've acknowledged and as one they need to work on. I kind of extrapolated from what I read to this next point. One of the key issues under the Millennium Development Goals is eliminating, creating universal primary education. And the biggest gap there is the rural areas of less developed countries. Now, again, the faith-based community has, I think, a real advantage in going at that one particular goal. Again, if you wanted to slice it that narrowly on that one particular goal. And then issues, again, Georg Carroll last night spoke at length about corruption. Corruption is one of the main problems in the developing world. How do you go about it? I mean, you can take a commercial, a business-based perspective like he was doing last night. I think that the tool you have in the faith-based communities to create the moral momentum to address the issue of corruption is seriously worth thinking about. Plus the gender issues, again, are knotty and difficult issues to work through in development, and I think it's a resource to think about. I extrapolated a couple of notions from what I saw here and what I liked and what resonated with me out of this effort, faith and development effort. And it's respect for the individual. To understand and address the core needs of development, you do have to respect. You have to obtain and respect local input and acknowledge the power of the faith organizations, both to organize and mobilize people and to change behavior. It's nonsensical to think you have to leave it off to the side somehow. I took this following quote from Madeleine Albright. She wrote a book after she'd left as Secretary of State called The Mighty and the Almighty. And it had to do with religion and policy making, and the United States in particular. And this was one of her conclusions, something that her father had said years before. Respect for the rights and well-being of each individual is the place where religious faith and a commitment to political liberty, and I threw in, or development, have their closest connection. A philosophy based on this principle has the most potential to bring people from opposing viewpoints together because it excludes no one and yet demands from everyone full consideration of the ideas and needs of others. I thought that was worth throwing in at this point. I'd like to wrap up, though, by kind of turning the mirror around and having you all think about yourselves for a second as individuals. I don't know how many of you have thought seriously about a career in development. Obviously, you're all thinking about it, at least in an academic sense. You're studying it now. Maybe you're going to go on to graduate school in it. But I'd like to just take a couple of minutes and put into kind of a broader perspective what it is that you're about if you're in the development field. Not long ago, I picked up a book. Any interesting book I get is usually on my wife's nightstand. And this was one by David McCullough about the experience of some Americans who went to France in the early and mid-1800s. They had all gone for the sake of I guess pursuing enlightenment. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Samuel Eliot Morison, there were some pretty illustrious people that went. And they left in their journals the grist for a very interesting book. And McCullough's a great writer anyway. But after passing over the ocean, they all generally would land at Le Havre and then go inland to Paris from there. And partway down the road, they got to the cathedral at Rouen, and this is the cathedral. Again, the journals left quite a bit of information about their reactions here, but one of the key things that that kind of stopped them in their tracks was they were staring at an edifice that took over 3 centuries to build. And they were coming from a country that was barely 50 years old. And I thought about that, and it kind of stopped me in my tracks for a second. I thought how ridiculous it would be for somebody to show up with General Dynamics at a board meeting or anywhere in the hierarchy and suggest a project that would last for 300 years. A government meeting? No way. A research project at a university? Okay, instinctively you can see why it's a ridiculous idea. But then it made me stop and think about the areas that I have been working in the last 30 years, the subject areas. I did Arab-Israeli peace for a while, Persian Gulf security, counterterrorism. For a while I was thickly involved in trying to expand the defense relationship between the US and India. And I thought for every single one of those, the time frame that we were given in order to achieve something substantial was, okay, look, you get something done in the next few months. Okay, you've got till the end of next year, at the latest by the next election cycle. And you stop and you think about those issues, and you think about the way we crowd ourselves into a time frame like that. And frankly, it's ridiculous. It is nonsensical. But on the other hand, how could you survive otherwise? Budgetarily, you don't have the money, the staffing to let stuff roll on at that pace. But I think it's the instinct that bothers me. I thought, because every one of you, I think, instinctively realized this is a non-starter. But are we capable of making a lasting contribution when we force ourselves to deal in time frames like this? Are we capable of making a civilizational impact when we're running from one thing to another, from one immediate benchmark to another, driven by resources and money? And it made me stop and think about the issue of development. And in a way, I think development is different. It is kind of a civilizational effort. It's something that is, I think, a unique hallmark of the times in which we live, where you see people on a global basis, on a sustained basis, pursuing an objective which is basically to eliminate some of the horrific things that have plagued mankind from the beginning. So as you think of what you might do as a career, as you think of how you might contribute, say you do take development, and it's kind of an assumption. Somebody here, I think, at one point in time will, somebody's going to the Peace Corps. We'll use that as the metaphor. There's a Peace Corps person. But stop and think. 30, 35 years from now, when you get to the end of your time, your turn, what contribution will you have made? How will you evaluate? Sorry, Ralph. How will you evaluate your contribution, your impact? I think it's important to be both humble and faithful in this regard. Humble in the sense that you are able to stand where you are, to even consider doing something like this because of the work of others. Somebody else who has established the field, somebody else who has opened the doors to those remote areas in those countries where you'd go and do your work. You stand on somebody else's shoulders, on somebody else's hilltops. But then when your time comes to say, okay, what have I done? It'll probably be the case that there will still be world hunger, there will still be disease, poverty, lack of education. But as you think about, if you will, simply laying down another layer of knowledge, adding to the experience, perhaps simply by your example, showing somebody else what it means to live a life involved in an effort like this. It's like the cathedral. There are breakthroughs, there have been. There's some marvelous features about this beautiful cathedral. There have been breakthroughs that will happen, but overwhelmingly the work of the day-to-day laying down of individual effort, just like the separate individual stones of the cathedral, this is what makes for the cumulative contribution. Thinking of yourself, and I'm urging you, you're now on the receiving end of education, but very soon the tables will turn and you've got to think yourself of passing the knowledge on. Be careful, be conscientious in what you learn, be conscious of what you're learning, be conscious of passing it forward. It's that kind of effort, that kind of conscientiousness that basically guarantees that 35 years from now you'll be standing at a luncheon speech, you'll be talking to somebody, and there will be people there, young people like yourself, ready to pick up the thread and carry it forward enthusiastically, maybe even inspiredly. At some point, the hilltop will get high enough and we'll be able to see the end. Thank you. Couple of questions? Easy ones, please. Which part of the country are you from?
California/New York.
Please, go ahead. I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, so over the intercession course at my school, I took an ethics class, and in that class we watched a debate in Public Square, is the Catholic Church a force for good in the world? And part of the criticism offered was, one of the things that I stuck out to me the most was the Catholic Church was spreading a rumor that use of condoms actually causes AIDS more than prevents it. So how would you say that these things are happening because religion is becoming a force in development, and also other things such as practices against like homosexuality, things that are issues of human rights?
That's a very, very tough question. There's no good answer to that. Are you aware of the polio workers in Nigeria, northern Nigeria, that were murdered not just a few weeks ago? If I understand the story correctly, the reason that they were killed was because religious groups had spread the rumor that the polio immunization would sterilize young girls. And let's just say this is the downside. The ability, the role that the faith leaders in the institutions have to shape people's beliefs, prolong their superstitions, to misinform. I guess the positive thing is by focusing attention on the role that they have, the potential they have to positively play a role, is the only way to bring, like the madrasas in Pakistan, like Doug Johnson and his group are doing, to kind of hold up the mirror, point out the positive aspects of what they're able to do, and hold them accountable, if you will, to the whole of their tradition, to their potential. But again, I was sickened when I heard, what had happened to those very brave people in Nigeria. There isn't a good answer. Does anybody else have a thought about that? I think it's an awfully good question.
We've talked.
Just speak loud.
Okay. We've talked extensively about the role of. We've talked extensively about the role of conflict in stopping development, And I understand that you were in Lebanon at the onset of the civil war, and so you've been exposed to this. And it seems that over the past few years, most of the conflict, be it Mali, be it the Arab Spring is not part of it, but a lot of conflict have been faith-based. And how do you think that interfaith groups can maybe overcome that challenge?
The limitations, I am very keenly aware of the limitations of governmental policy-based initiatives. Okay, I have been not at the highest levels, but at reasonably intimate levels of governmental interaction having to do with, again, issues Persian Gulf security, Arab-Israeli peace. There's a limit to what they can do. A lot of it I would throw under the heading of the blah, blah, blah. You know, they sit around and they talk in circles, and then the next administration comes and the talking points are 75% the same, and it's, but we had a chance over the course of my time as well to be involved in what is called Track 2 diplomacy, which is primarily, at least in the season in which I was involved, it was academically based dialogue. And let's just say it was very heartening to see people-to-people interactions change people's perspectives. You can't expect overnight success, but I don't see how you can expect lasting success in the absence of respecting the individual, conscientiously trying to address gaps in knowledge, gaps in feeling. There are reasons that people feel, there's two sides to every story. There are reasons that people feel the way they do. Having lived in Iran as a kid, you know, I had 2 years. My Little League baseball career started in Tehran. Okay, this is, you can now say you met, if you're ever on Jeopardy, that trivia question comes up, you'll know who it was. But the Track 2 programs that I'm now aware of increasingly are taking faith and religion into account as a piece of the picture. It's not the whole story, it never is. But without being this real, this true to what is important to people, and again, as she pointed out, religion in a lot of instances will fuel people's prejudices. It'll justify and reinforce their prejudices. And you have to work through that and hold people accountable to the potential in them. And I think, again, to exclude religion, faith, the power of respecting, showing respect for somebody else's faith and beliefs and interest in them is mind-boggling. And this was one of the high points of my entire professional career. We were in Antalya, Turkey, and we had a workshop that was taking place between military officials of about 13 different states and the PLO and the Israelis in the Middle East. And what happens in the corridors is always more interesting than what happens when the blah, blah, blah is happening, you know, in the plenary sessions. And I watched at a very small table a Saudi naval commodore and an Israeli naval captain sit down and have tea together. And it was stunning. This was the early 1990s, and they spent, you know, the whole break just sitting there chatting. And they got up and they walked away in opposite directions. I saw both of them shake their heads. They couldn't actually believe what they had just done. So I'm from the school that says the individual, their attitudes, the breaking away of removing the scales from their eyes. This is the kind of thing that's important, and it takes time. It takes time. You have to just reconcile yourself to, it may not change on my watch permanently, or it may not be resolved in my watch, but I can contribute to change. And again, it really is, a lot of it is, most of it is about education. simply opening people's eyes. Is that it? All right. Thank you very much.